My father called my wedding an embarrassment before he even bothered to skip it. My name is Courtney Blake, daughter of a U.S. senator who decided his image mattered more than watching his eldest child say her vows. On the day I got married, I already knew he and my mother would stay away. I thought the worst thing I would feel was the sting of two empty chairs and the kind of silence that follows you home. I was wrong. Right after the ceremony, still in my dress, I opened the family group chat that usually held charity photos and campaign updates. My hands were steady in a way my heart was not. I attached one single picture from my wedding and hit send without adding a word. Just an image. Proof of the life I had chosen without their permission. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. No congratulations, no questions, not even a fake heart emoji. Then my screen lit up like an alarm panel. First my mother, then my father, then my younger sister, then numbers I recognized from the campaign. Call after call, message after message, all hitting at once, as if that one photo had set off a fire in a house they thought was fireproof. They were not panicking because I had married a mechanic. They were panicking because of what else was in that frame, and what it could do to everything they had spent decades building. If you've ever been treated like a stain on your family's perfect picture, stay with me. And before we go on, tell me, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I thought their absence at my wedding was the end of our story. I didn't know it was the opening shot of something bigger. Years before anything exploded, the rules of my family had already been written in stone inside our house in Washington, D.C. My father, Senator Malcolm Blake, treated that house like an extension of his office. Every hallway felt like backstage, every meal like a rehearsal for the next camera. My mother, Margaret Blake, moved through it like a stage manager, smoothing napkins and expressions, making sure nothing ever looked out of place. I was their oldest, the one expected to understand that appearances came first and feelings were a distant second. By the time I reached high school, I knew exactly where I stood. I was the serious one who read too much and smiled too little, the one they trusted to sit through donor dinners without spilling anything on the white tablecloth. My younger sister, Alyssa Blake, was the one they held out in front of the world. She laughed easily, knew how to charm a room, and picked up cameras the way most people picked up water glasses. When campaign staff stopped by, they called her relatable in a way that was never said about me. There were no screaming fights in our house, almost never any raised voices. My father did not need to shout. He could cut me down with a look, with one measured comment about how I had disappointed him, how my choices reflected on his name. My mother did not argue either. She reminded me that his career paid for everything around us and that the least I could do was not make things harder. I learned to read every shift in his expression the way other kids learn to read road signs. A slight tightening around his eyes meant I had said too much. A pause before he answered meant I should change the subject. A long exhale at the dinner table meant I had somehow embarrassed him in front of guests. It was training in how not to be seen. One afternoon, when I was about 15, I went looking for an old yearbook in the storage room off the upstairs hallway. The room smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, stacked with boxes from past campaigns and school projects my mother kept for show. In the back of a cabinet, I found a flat cardboard box filled with loose photographs. Most of the pictures were familiar. Handshakes on stages, posed smiles in front of flags, my parents at charity galas. Then I pulled out one I had never seen. Two young men leaned against the hood of a beat-up truck, sun in their faces, arms slung around each other's shoulders. One of them was unmistakably my father, younger and looser in the shoulders, hair longer, grin wide. The other man looked so much like him that for half a second I thought the photo had been double exposed. They had the same jawline, the same eyes, the same dimple at the corner of the mouth. But there was something softer in the stranger's face. He looked like my father might have looked, if he had never learned how to weaponize a smile. On the back of the photo, In faded ink, there was only a year and one word I could not quite make out. Standing there in that cramped room, the photo in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It did not fit the story I had been told about our family. I had never heard my father mention a brother. I had never seen my mother set an extra place at the table or seen a man who looked like this in any of the framed collages in the hallway. The sound of my mother's heels in the hallway snapped me out of it. I slipped the other photos back into their box but kept that one, as if someone might be able to explain it. I stepped back into the hall, heart beating faster for reasons I could not name yet. That was the first time I understood that parts of our family history were missing on purpose, and that the man in that photograph had been cut out as neatly as a face sliced from a frame. In the years that followed, that hidden photograph stayed tucked inside a notebook I kept on my top shelf, a quiet reminder that something in our family story had been rewritten. As I moved into adulthood, the distance between me and my parents didn't come from one dramatic argument. It came from a steady erosion of trust, a gradual understanding that my worth to them depended entirely on how well I reinforced their public image. College applications were treated like campaign strategy briefs. Career paths were evaluated according to how they might look in a headline. My father never asked what I wanted. He asked what would make sense for a Blake. During that time, I gravitated toward spaces that felt nothing like our polished house. Outdoor repair shops, community centers, noisy places where people shouted across rooms and no one cared about spotless carpet. That was where I met people who lived without rehearsing their words. Their lives were messy, honest, unedited in a way that rattled something awake inside me. I never mentioned this shift to my family. By then I understood that certain truths, especially the ones that made me feel alive, were best kept out of the Blake household. I learned to move through their world with practiced calm, while building a separate life out of view. It was during one of my visits home from college that a second clue appeared. My parents were getting ready to host a fundraiser, and I had been tasked with organizing boxes in the basement. While clearing a shelf, I found a thin envelope wedged between stacked storage bins. Inside were a few documents, nothing remarkable at first glance, but among them lay a folded letter bearing handwriting that looked nothing like my father's firm, deliberate script. The strokes were looser, curved, almost familiar. The letter wasn't long. It referenced a disagreement, something about principles, something about refusing to go along with a plan. It didn't mention names, only initials, but the tone carried a weight of betrayal. Whoever wrote it had cared deeply, and whoever received it had chosen silence instead of reconciliation. I didn't take the letter, but its contents rode home with me like an unanswered question. The family narrative I had been raised with, that we were united, orderly, unbreakable, began to feel brittle. Around this time, my connection to Ezra Carter began to take shape. He worked in a local hangar where he spent long hours repairing small aircraft. I met him during an internship project, and what struck me first wasn't his skill, but the steadiness in the way he listened. Ezra existed in a world without polished performances. He valued precision, integrity, and quiet determination. Being around him felt like stepping off a stage I had never chosen to stand on. I found myself returning to the hangar under the pretense of work, though what I sought was the calm that settled around him. Our conversations were casual at first, then deeper as time passed. He spoke about engines and solutions and building something from scratch, not about optics or alliances. Without ever saying it aloud, he showed me a version of life where identity didn't need approval to matter. I realized slowly, almost reluctantly, that I trusted him in a way I had never trusted anyone in my family. And that trust made me protective of him, of the quiet world we were creating on the margins of my parents' expectations. At that point, I still believed I could keep both worlds separate, the one my parents designed for me and the one I was building for myself. I didn't yet understand that they were already on a collision course, set in motion long before I was old enough to recognize the signs. By the time Ezra and I decided to get married, the distance between my life and the Blake household had widened into something permanent. The wedding took place in a small lakeside chapel near the outskirts of Denver, a quiet place with worn pews and sunlight that drifted through tall windows in soft, uneven stripes. I chose it because it felt real, unpolished, honest, untouched by the expectations that had shaped so much of my upbringing. I didn't send out formal invitations to my parents. I informed them the way one might notify an office of a scheduled absence. Straightforward, brief, and without the slightest hope of warmth in return. Their silence that followed was predictable, though the final confirmation arrived in the form of a message from my mother. The wording was polite, efficient, and entirely devoid of emotion. It referenced my father's obligations, hinted that my choices complicated things, and ended with a reminder that timing mattered in politics. It didn't acknowledge my engagement, my future, or the fact that her eldest daughter was getting married. When the ceremony began, I felt the absence of the two empty seats only as a faint ache, like a bruise I had learned to ignore. The people who filled the chapel were not tied to me by blood, but by something sturdier. People from the aviation hangar, a few close friends from school, Ezra's co-workers, individuals who showed up because they wanted to, not because it was expected. And among them sat a man I had met only months earlier, Thomas Hale. I recognized him not by introduction, but by resemblance. The same jaw, the same eyes as the man in the photograph I had found years ago, the one that had never belonged anywhere in my parents' curated narrative. When I first encountered Thomas at a small community event, I didn't know his name. I only sensed a familiarity that unsettled something inside me. Later, after a brief, quiet conversation where he revealed his connection to my father, the raw truth began to surface. Thomas carried himself with understated confidence, the kind that did not seek attention but made its presence felt all the same. He didn't act like someone who came to reclaim a place in my life. He acted like someone who had once been pushed out of a place in his own. I didn't ask for the full story that day. I wasn't ready to confront what I already suspected. At the reception, held under a canopy in Ezra's workplace courtyard, I drifted through clusters of guests, feeling lighter than I had in years. Laughter rose from tables scattered with food and mismatched decorations. Nothing about it resembled a Blake event. No polished speeches, no photographers, no filtered perfection. Just real joy, uncoordinated and imperfect. Ezra moved through the space with the ease of someone who knew exactly who he was. Seeing him like that, confident, grounded, made me understand why my parents could never accept him. He couldn't be shaped or leveraged, couldn't be folded into a political strategy. As the evening settled into a comfortable rhythm, Ezra wrapped an arm around me, and for a moment the noise faded. I felt the solidity of the life we were marking together, a life built far from the pressure of curated appearances. That was when I noticed Thomas sitting quietly near one of the tables, watching the celebration with a reflective expression. There was no resentment in his gaze, only a kind of calm acceptance that made something tighten in my chest. I understood then why his presence mattered in a way my parents' absence did not. Later, when someone asked for a group picture, Ezra and I stood together, and Thomas stepped in beside us. The moment was simple, natural, unforced. But as the camera shutter clicked, I felt an undeniable shift, like a door closing behind me and another opening ahead, both carrying the weight of a truth I could no longer ignore. As the week after the wedding unfolded, the consequences of that single photograph began to take shape in ways I had not fully anticipated. The image I sent, just the three of us standing together, had landed in my family group chat like a spark in a room filled with dry paper. I didn't respond to the barrage of calls that followed. I didn't explain the picture or answer any of the frantic messages. Instead, I let the silence stretch, knowing instinctively that silence unsettled my parents more than anger ever could. But beneath that quiet, I sensed a shift rippling outward. My parents had spent years constructing an image of a unified, dignified political family, and the sudden appearance of Thomas Hale, a man they had worked carefully to erase, threatened to fracture the facade they depended on. A few days later, a sleek sedan pulled into the gravel lot behind Ezra's hangar. I recognized the tinted windows before I recognized the woman stepping out. Alyssa Blake moved across the space in careful strides, as if the uneven ground posed a personal insult. She wore tailored denim and an immaculate blazer, her hair pulled back with the precision my mother prized. Her sudden presence didn't surprise me, but the strain around her eyes did. She wasn't here for reconciliation. I could feel it before she spoke. She was here because something in her world was slipping, something she didn't know how to manage alone. I led her to a quieter corner of the hangar where she could escape the noise of machinery. Her hands stayed clasped too tightly, and she kept glancing at the floor as if the right words might appear there. I could see the same sharp tension she used to carry during childhood rehearsals for public appearances, the tension of someone expected to smile through discomfort. She finally explained, piece by piece, what had been happening at home since the wedding. The calls I ignored weren't just emotional reactions, they were attempts at containment. My father had been in the middle of negotiations with a major industrial partner, and the resurfacing of Thomas had sent ripples through networks that relied heavily on curated narratives. According to Alyssa, questions had already begun circulating among political allies who remembered fragments of old rumors, stories of a family dispute, a partnership that had dissolved without explanation, a relative who had vanished from public view. The photograph didn't confirm anything directly, but it raised enough doubt that others started pulling at threads my parents had worked hard to knot together. As she spoke, I watched the careful composure she tried to maintain. Despite her practiced calm, her disappointment was palpable. She wasn't angry on my parents' behalf. She was angry because her own plans were beginning to unravel. Her social circles depended on stability, and now the ground beneath her was shifting. What struck me most was the realization that she wasn't asking for clarity about Thomas, or even about my marriage. She wanted control restored, equilibrium regained. She wanted me to fall back into line long enough to quiet the whispers. I didn't offer what she wanted. I didn't soften what needed to remain firm. Standing beside the aircraft frame behind me, I felt the difference between the world that had shaped me and the world I was choosing. The former demanded silence, the latter depended on truth. By the time Alyssa left, the tension in her shoulders had sharpened, and she walked toward her car with the posture of someone stepping back into a life she no longer recognized. I watched the sedan disappear beyond the chain-link fence, aware that her visit marked only the beginning of a much larger unraveling. Whatever had been set in motion could no longer be controlled, not by my parents, and no longer by me. In the days that followed Alyssa's visit, the tension around my family tightened like a wire pulled too far. News began to circulate quietly through political circles, small murmurs at first, then sharper questions directed toward my father's office. I didn't need direct confirmation to understand what was happening. Years of living in that household had taught me how quickly unease spreads when a narrative is threatened. The resurfacing of Thomas was more than a personal reminder of old wounds. It was evidence of a story my parents had kept buried, and now the soil around it was loosening. I tried to keep my regular routine at the hangar, but even there, echoes of the outside world reached me. Ezra, sensing the shift, watched carefully without pressing. The stability of his presence grounded me, yet I still felt the weight of what was unfolding. My parents had built their careers on control, control of perception, control of messaging, control of every detail that touched the Blake name. Losing control wasn't something they knew how to withstand. It didn't take long for the fallout to grow more public. One morning, while I was sorting maintenance logs in Ezra's office, my phone buzzed with an alert from a political news site. The headline mentioned an internal audit tied to one of the industrial negotiations my father had been pursuing. There was nothing explosive in the article, no accusations, no confirmed wrongdoing, just a series of pointed questions about transparency, influence, and the possibility of long-standing internal conflicts resurfacing. But in politics, questions alone are enough to set fires. I read the piece twice, understanding immediately what the audit represented. It wasn't about policy disputes or budget concerns. It was about cracks in a carefully maintained image, and my father's rivals were seizing the opportunity to widen those cracks. The article mentioned no names beyond official titles, yet the timing was unmistakable. The moment Thomas appeared again, in my life and in the photograph, old uncertainties revived. People who had once accepted my father's polished reputation without hesitation were now revisiting memories they had filed away years ago. The realization came slowly, then all at once. My photograph hadn't caused the unraveling. It had merely removed the last layer of varnish hiding a fracture that had existed long before I was old enough to understand it. As the day continued, I found myself returning to the photo I had taken at the wedding. The ease in Thomas's posture contrasted sharply with the tension etched into every public picture of my father. That contrast alone spoke volumes about their history, even without knowing the full truth. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside the hangar to clear my thoughts. The sharp scent of engine fuel mingled with the crisp Colorado air. For the first time since sending the photo, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my parents' unraveling had nothing to do with me choosing Ezra. It had everything to do with the truth they once buried suddenly having a face again, one they couldn't control or contextualize. I didn't feel guilt. What I felt was clarity, the kind that reveals how much of your life was shaped by someone else's fear. My parents had raised me to believe that protecting the family meant protecting their image, but standing outside the hangar, I finally understood that an image built on a mission can't survive reality. I didn't know how far the consequences would spread, nor how my parents would attempt to regain their ground. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next wouldn't be determined by the expectations that once defined me. The truth had already taken its first steps into the open, and I had stopped stepping aside for it. By the time the questions around my father intensified, I sensed that the distance between us had reached a point where nothing could be repaired. One evening, after a long shift at the hangar, I returned home to find an envelope slipped under my door. My name appeared on the front in my mother's careful handwriting. Inside was a short message asking me to come to the Blake residence for a necessary conversation. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the upheaval surrounding them, just an expectation that I would show up because I always had. I went, not out of obligation, but because I needed to close the last door still standing open. When I stepped into the house, the silence felt sharper than I remembered. My father stood near the dining room, rigid posture, restrained expression, signs I recognized as attempts to regain control. My mother lingered behind him, watching me with a mixture of worry and calculation. They did not ask how I was or how my life had changed since the wedding. They focused instead on the fallout they were experiencing: scrutiny from colleagues, strained alliances, unexpected inquiries into their past decisions. As they spoke, I listened without responding. Every word confirmed what I had already learned over years of careful observation. Their concern was not about family, but about containment. They viewed the rising questions as an inconvenience, a disruption to a narrative they believed they deserved to protect. My father eventually shifted the conversation toward me. He implied that my choices had accelerated the sudden attention on his office, that I had disregarded what the Blake name represented. He spoke as if my life outside this house was a deviation, rather than a reality I had built with intention. The more he talked, the clearer it became that he still expected me to align myself with his goals, even now, even after everything. Standing there, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. I looked at the walls, the arranged photographs, the curated version of our family that had never matched the truth. I felt no anger, only certainty. The part of me that once sought their approval had fallen away long before this moment. When I spoke, my voice remained steady. I told them that my life was no longer tied to theirs, that the choices I made were not subject to political strategy or reputation management. I told them I would not be returning to this house again. I didn't raise my voice or offer accusations. I simply stated the boundary that had been forming in me for years. My father's expression tightened, a barely visible shift, but enough to show that he understood what I meant. My mother's breath caught slightly, though she said nothing to stop me. Their silence felt like confirmation that the bond between us had always been conditional, held together by expectations I no longer carried. I turned and walked out of the Blake residence without hesitation. The night air felt sharp and clean against my skin. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what it meant to choose my own life, one not shaped by silence, not moderated by appearances, not dependent on approval that would never come freely. There was no triumph in that moment, only release. Leaving was not a victory over them. It was a return to myself. Her story stands as a reminder that some families fracture not through explosive conflict, but through years of quiet expectations that leave no space for authenticity. Courtney Blake learned that choosing peace often requires walking away from people who refuse to see you beyond their own needs. Her resolve shows that boundaries are not acts of rebellion, they are acts of preservation. For anyone who has ever felt defined by someone else's image, her journey offers a simple truth. You are allowed to step out of the frame. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, consider supporting the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them.